Hey everyone, my name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so very honored to welcome Julia Watts Belser in conversation with Dom Kelly and Andrew Walker Cornetta for a discussion of loving our own bones, disability wisdom, and the spiritual subversiveness of knowing ourselves whole. It's a transformative spiritual companion and deep dive into disability politics that reimagines disability in the Bible and contemporary culture. It's an essential read that will foster and enrich conversations about disability, spirituality, and social justice. Tonight's event was spearheaded and is co-sponsored by the Georgia State University Department of Religious Studies. And we are so grateful for that. It's always exciting when someone brings us an event ready-made and says, hey, I think this would be really cool. So thank you so much to Andrew for making this happen. And I'll actually introduce Andrew first. Andrew Walker Cornetta is an assistant professor of religious studies at Georgia State University, where he teaches courses on religion, disability, race, and health. His forthcoming article in the journal American Religion is titled Without the Lord, Eliza Suggs, Religion and the Good Disabled Subject. So thank you to Andrew for making tonight happen. We're joined by Dom Kelly, who is the co-founder, president, and CEO of New Disabled South, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and New Disabled South Rising, its 501c4 arm. Until November 2022, he served as both the Georgia fundraising director and the senior advisor for disability for Stacey Abrams' campaign for governor of Georgia. Previously, he was senior fundraising manager and a strategic advisor for disability at Fair Fight Action, the voting rights organization founded by Stacey Abrams, where he also created and led the organization's Disability Council, composed of prominent disability advocates and policy experts from across the country. Dom is one of a set of triplets born with cerebral palsy and has been a disability advocate since he was 4 years old. He received a Master's of Science and Nonprofit Leadership degree from the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, where he also received the Excellence in Social Impact Award. Additionally, he holds a bachelor's degree in music production, a master's degree in journalism, an executive certificate in social impact strategy, and a graduate certificate in interdisciplinary disability studies. He was a 2021 New Leaders Council Fellow. He serves as a board member for the Kelsey Society of Disability Studies, Neighborhood Access, Disability Victory, and the University of Pennsylvania's Nonprofit Leadership Alumni Association. He's a member of the Nation Swell Council, and he currently lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with his wife, Katie, their daughter, Mahalia, and their dog, Vivi. So welcome, Dom, and thank you for all that you do for Georgia and for people around the country. And the person whose book we are here to honor is Julia Watts Belser. She is a professor of Jewish studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, as well as core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program, and a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Her research centers on gender, sexuality, and disability and rabbinic literature, as well as queer feminist Jewish ethics and theology. She directs Disability and Climate Change, a public archive project, an initiative that documents the wisdom and insights of disabled activists, artists, and first responders on the front lines of the climate crisis. Her work brings ancient texts into conversation with disability studies, queer theory, feminist thought, and environmental ethics. She has held faculty fellowships at Harvard Divinity School and the Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Rabbinic Tales of Destruction, Gender, Sex, and Disability in the Ruins of Jerusalem, as well as Power, Ethics, and Ecology, Rabbinic Responses to Drought and Disaster. Her most recent book is the book we are celebrating tonight, Loving Our Own Bones. A rabbi and a longtime advocate for disability and gender justice, Belser writes queer feminist Jewish theology and brings disability arts and culture into conversation with Jewish tradition. She co-authored an international health handbook for women with disabilities, developed in collaboration with disability activists from 42 countries, and translated into 14 languages, designed to help challenge the root causes of poverty, gender violence, and disability discrimination. She's an avid wheelchair hiker, a lover of wild places, and a passionate supporter of disability dance. So welcome to you, Dr. Belser. We are so happy to have you here. And welcome to you all. Our interpreter tonight is Nat Skinner. Nat is Karis's favorite interpreter, and we're so honored to have them with us tonight. So thank you so much, Nat, for being with us. Thank you all for being with us. We want to invite you at any time to engage with us in the chat. And I see we already got great questions, so you can put questions in the chat. But Julia has explicitly said, feel free to just share your experience in the chat. Clap back, share whatever feelings arise for you. Yes, and various things. Whatever feels right, we would love to hear from you in the chat. You may also ask questions at any time. So thank you so much. And on with the show.
All right, shall I go ahead and start us off? I am just really delighted to be here tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for turning out. And I'm really looking forward to having the chance, Andrew and Dom, to be in conversation with both of you. But let me begin just by saying a few words about my book, Loving Our Own Bones, and tell you a little bit about some of the longings and hopes that really drive the book and bring it into being. So this book, Loving Our Own Bones, dives deep into ableism and disability injustice, looking at how that manifests both in religious texts and in contemporary culture. And it also lays out a spiritual and political invitation to reimagine our world, our cultural and religious traditions in ways that honor the vibrant complexity of all of our bodies and minds. You know, when I was writing Loving Our Own Bones, I thought at some point it was like a light bulb for me. I realized this book was intended as a love letter to disability community and to all of us, disabled or not, who have been made to feel that our bodies or minds don't fit, don't belong, right? Aren't good enough for this world. I wanted to honor the way that disabled communities push back against normativity, the way we teach each other to let go of shame and silence, the way we recognize and claim and witness each other's lives as worthy, as brilliant, as beautiful, and as beloved, even in the face of a world that often treats us like trash. So I wrote this book with fierce love for queer and disabled kin, but I want to be clear, I also wrote this book for all of us. As I said, you know, I think so many people in so many ways for so many different but often interrelated reasons internalize the message that we're not good enough or that we're too much trouble. Right? So while I ground my work particularly in my own queer and disabled experience, I also spend a lot of time in the book thinking about and exploring the ways normativity hits hard against so many of us, Black and brown people, fat people, women and femmes, trans and non-binary kin, Jews, Muslims, minoritized folks of all kinds. One of the things I do in Loving Our Own Bones is to lift up the political and spiritual significance of what I call disability wisdom. And, you know, I don't mean by this like some sort of inherent wisdom that comes to you because of a disability experience. I mean the kind of hard-won wisdom that comes from navigating a world that was not built for us. Right? And a world that so often works to exclude and marginalize us. Say just at the outset, when I think about and talk about disability, I mean that in a really expansive way. I'm thinking here about disability as a broad category that includes sensory disability, physical disability, cognitive, intellectual disability, neurodivergence and neurodiversity, mental health disabilities, depression, anxiety. I myself am a wheelchair user, which is in most circumstances, not over Crowdcast or Zoom, a highly visible disability, at least for sighted folks. But in many ways, I think that's an anomaly. Most disabilities are not immediately apparent. But when we think about disability, I'm always thinking politically about disability. I think about the way we live in a world that is set up to accommodate and make things smooth for people with certain kinds of bodies and minds. And yet like a world that excludes, that pushes out folks with other kinds of bodies and minds. And so whether that's the physicality of our architecture, to the way we structure time, the norms of how our schools or workplaces or cities work, disability exclusion is so often built into the fabric of our very lives. And it also sinks really deep roots into our religious traditions. I write as a rabbi and a scholar of Jewish studies. So Loving Our Own Bones digs deep into Jewish tradition, into texts from the Torah or the Hebrew Bible, as well as later Jewish texts like Midrash and Talmud. I'm also a scholar of religion and disability more broadly. So in the book, I also look at Christian texts and traditions. And I think a lot about the role that religious discourse plays in popular culture. Right? I think, all of us living in the United States today know you don't have to be religious to have been burned by religion or religious readings of politics, of women's bodies, of disabled, queer, Black people's bodies, right? This religion matters in our world as a political force. And so I think even for folks who are deeply secular in their own orientation, part of my instinct in the book is that it matters for us to dive into and grapple with religious texts and traditions. I'm also of the mind that religion belongs to us if you want it, right? Spirituality belongs to us, right, if you want it. And so in that sense, my commitment is also to envision, imagine, flesh out the possibilities of religious and spiritual traditions that center disability, that really get the life breathed into them through an engagement with disability wisdom and lived disability experience. I think the last thing I'd say before I open it up to conversation with Dom and Andrew is whenever I'm thinking about disability, I'm always thinking about the way that the political and the spiritual intertwine. Because when I think about disability, I'm fundamentally thinking about the key question of social transformation. Loving Our Own Bones is a spiritual companion, yes, but it's also a political call. A call to recognize and resist ableism, to reimagine community, to rethink care, to envision and really feel in our bones what collective liberation can look like, to imagine and get down to the business of building a world where all of us thrive. So I'll give just one example, and that's the way ableism runs hand in hand with productivity culture. Right? In the world in which so many of us live, right? Dominant culture really uses our ability to work as an assessment of our worth. It is so pervasive, and it's such a lie. Right? And of course, it's a lie that hits really hard against sick and disabled folks, though honestly, it's coming for all of us. Right? It's that lie that says we are only as good as our last accomplishment. Right? That we have to work, never rest, right? Never pull back. It is such a brutal culture of efficiency that runs roughshod over our actual lives. And so for me, that really grounds, and I hope I give that as a kind of example of one of the commitments that is kind of cornerstone to this work. The political claim, spiritual claim, that ableism hurts all of us. Of course, ableism, right, hits hardest against disabled folks, right? But it's coming for all of us, right? Ableism is not good for anyone with a body. We all get sick. We all need rest. We all need care. None of our bodies and minds will always work like clockwork forever. It's just not a part of the human condition or human experience. And so even as I want to affirm a world in which disability matters as a distinctive cultural, political identity and experience, I also simultaneously want to say we all have a stake. We all have a stake in working to uproot ableism and to transform this world so that it is actually a space where all of our bodies and minds can thrive and be welcome as they actually are. So that's a little glimpse of the book and some of what motivates me as a writer. Dom, I'd love to kind of turn it over to you. I'd love to just talk together a little bit. Let me know where you'd like to go.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm honored to be able to have this conversation with you. And there's so much going through my mind. There's so much that resonated with me. For the big thing that is really on my heart is I had to highlight some, and I won't read everything verbatim, but I had to highlight some things. And I didn't give you this question. I really just wanted to set the tone with this. But in chapter 11, the politics of beauty, one thing that really stood out to me was after you tell the story of Leah and Rachel, and you talk about this idea that Leah may be disabled based on the text, and near the end of that, you talk about how the Talmud reassures us that aesthetics are only skin deep, that we have to look at Leah's heart, not at her eyes. But you say there's something unsatisfying about this response, something that concedes to Jacob's initial judgment. I don't want a world where we look past her eyes. I want us to savor the shape of her skin, her face, her very particularity. I want her to savor that herself. I want her to own her own splendor, to know her own magnificence. And that really, that was so beautiful and profound to me. And I think it also reminds me of you starting this book out with that question that someone asked of what's wrong with you, right? That we as disabled people, we want to be seen, but we also want to be seen in the way that we see ourselves. I don't believe there's anything wrong with me. That's kind of an ugly question, but someone's seeing my disability at the same time, which is also what I want. And so this book has brought up so many questions for me around my own religious identity as a Jew, as somebody who comes from an interfaith family. I'm a triplet. My fraternal brother was a full-time chair user, and he passed away when we were 6. And I heard people say that don't prescribe to the same theology as me, he's free. He's running or he's walking where he is. That's not what I subscribe to. And so there's so much ableism rooted in all of that. So I'm wondering, and I didn't ask you this question, I apologize ahead of time, but
no, this is perfect. This is perfect.
In your work as both a disabled person and a religious scholar, have you had to grapple with that internalized ableism, and then how have you gone on that journey of accepting your own disability and the way society sees you versus the way you want society to see you as a disabled person?
Yeah, I mean, this is there's so much here. I feel like in so many ways you've named the crux of so much of the work, right? So I'm I'm seeing in the chat a comment that's really resonating with me from Sonia. So much insensitivity in one comment, and I feel like this is the experience that so many disabled folks have, the experience of sort of having often well-intentioned religious or spiritualizing language come at us and just feel really awful, right? I name that it's often well-intentioned because I actually think sometimes it's harder for me to deal with grossness when people are meaning to be nice. When they're just being jerks, somehow it's easier to just be like, oh, get out of here, just take your garbage and get out of here. Of course, that gets under my skin too. But there's something, the knife is particularly sharp when it's either coming from someone I love or it's meant as a kind of comfort, right? And so I think this is naming why, as a queer feminist rabbi, I find myself spending a lot of time working with folks who've been burned by religion, right? Who want nothing to do with religious spaces because it feels, especially in disability communities, religious language, spiritual language often feels very paternalizing, very objectifying. I'll just say for the record, sort of Jewish tradition leaves the idea of sort of heaven or an afterlife very open-ended. So it's very choose your own adventure here. But I will say, if there is a heaven, as a wheelchair user, I think surely heaven must be finally a wheelchair accessible space, right? And once and for all, right, it's going to be a smooth, beautiful, smooth rolling, without barriers, right? That's when I envision, right, the kind of afterlife of my dreams, right? It's that. But I, of course, am not content to leave it to the hereafter, right? I'm committed to building that in, I think, very Jewish fashion, building that in the here and now, in this world. You were naming down this question of like how to be wanting to be seen as disabled, but not wanting to be seen in objectifying ways, right? In ways, I start the book with an anecdote where, somebody in synagogue after, making conversation says, what happened to you? What's wrong with you, right? And like, it's such a telling assessment of the way disability is positioned in our culture, that disability always seems to prompt a need for a story, right? An explanation, a reason for being. I am always trying to create more space to recognize that there's a power imbalance here. Right? That strangers on the street feel empowered to just, receive all sorts of intimate details about my life to fulfill their own curiosity, which is just, that's inequitable, right? There's a kind of exchange here that's not right. So I think for me, that's been a really helpful way of knowing like how in disability community often folks are really hesitant to ask one another about diagnosis or specific detail. We have sort of this code of like, in the best way, right? Don't put people on the spot to have to like prove their disability cred or whatever, right? Or tell their medical stories or whatever. And I think that's in part a reaction to the way in which dominant culture often demands kind of full accounting of a life in order to be able to negotiate all sorts of circumstances. So I feel actually very protective of my private life in this way, even as I really want to be seen and known and recognized as a disabled person, as a disabled woman. And I use the term, seeing a question in the chat, I use, like many people in disability communities today, I embrace the term disability as a either neutral or positive term of affiliation. And I prefer that to terms like differently abled, which always feel to me like euphemisms or like trying to make nice. Now, different disability, like different subsets within the disability community have different norms and practices, and people's individual mileage may vary. But I think we're really seeing culturally a shift toward recognizing disability as kind of cultural and political identity, and not as a bad word, right? Or as a negative experience.
So I wanted to ask about, in chapter 4, chapter 4 is called Ableism, the social political dimension of disability. You talk about the story of Sodom, and you quote, "The people of Sodom had a certain bed on which all travelers slept. If the guest was too tall, they shortened him by cutting off his feet. If the guest was too short, they stretched him out until he fit." So I think that was a really great example that you shared about how the Torah views disability and where that ableist, eugenicist thought kind of comes from. So between that and that chapter on beauty that we just talked about, it paints a picture of maybe the disabled experience to me throughout history. So in your view, what does an anti-ableist Jewish practice look like?
Yeah. So thank you so much for lifting up this passage. From the passage that actually comes from the Talmud, a post-biblical Jewish text, where the rabbis are thinking about, they inherit this biblical story, a story from the Torah about the wicked, cruel city of Sodom. Just to be very clear, because the story of Sodom sometimes still gets told as a kind of like anti-gay, anti-queer story. That's a deep misreading of that story, both in biblical terms and also in terms of the way that it's read in classical Jewish tradition. The rabbis in the Talmud see, and elsewhere in the Bible, also earlier even in the Bible, see the sin of Sodom, right, as a sin of cruelty and inhospitality. Right? The basic problem is violence, in this case, profound sexual violence to men who have come in a vulnerable position, right, in a state of great vulnerability, right, and are treated abhorrently, violently, cruelly. Okay? So the rabbis in the Talmud inherit the story, and they think, what was so they want to paint a picture of what is so terrible about what the people of Sodom did. And the story that Dom just told, right, about this bed, this one size fits all bed, right, or doesn't fit all bed, right, that they have, right? The rabbis imagine that those like mean men in Sodom make everyone who comes into the city lay down on the same bed. And if you don't fit it, they drag you and stretch you out until you fit the bed. And if your feet are too big for the bed, right, off with the feet, right? So the rabbis don't really think about it in precisely these terms, but I think it's a classic example of ableism in action. When I think of one of the ways that ableism works, okay, one of the ways ableism works is it says we would rather do profound violence to people to make them fit a neat, tight little norm, right? Fit within the structure, right? Rather than expanding the structures that we live in order to fit the actual people, right? So part of how ableism operates says, look, we've got this one way to do things. And if you can't hack it, the problem is you. Whereas I think the key anti-ableist move is to say, fix the system, change the system, right? Get a bigger bed, right? I was teaching this story at one point, and somebody said, okay, so fine, maybe we can see how it's problematic if the guy is too long for the bed. You could sort of envision that, like, all right, maybe you'd like for him to be able to get his feet on the full mattress. But what's the problem with a guy who's too short? Why do you have to stretch him out? Right? Like, what does that hurt anybody? And I think, to me, it's so telling to see that the investment here is not actually about the well-being of people. It's the desire to make people the same. And that move, that kind of eugenicist move, the idea that what we really want is for everybody to turn out like little carbon copy images of some ideal type, I think is just it's so violent, but it's also so wrong. So your question, Tom, about like what do we envision here? Like what would an anti-ableist practice look like? Right? On the practical standpoint, it means taking a wrench to the systems that want to say there's only one tight way, one narrow little way to do things. And if you can't measure up according to that rubric, you're out, right? And busting more space for our actual human bodies and minds, right? So pragmatically, that's the thing. And then culturally, religiously, spiritually, it's also training and teaching ourselves to see call it what you want, beauty, brilliance, magnificence, gorgeousness, fierceness, fabulousness of our bodies and minds as they actually are. That's where, for me, I think beauty, the recognition of beauty, not in some ideal type, right? Not in the crappy fashion magazine version, right? But in the actual like brilliance of us, that what disability organizer Mia Mingus calls our magnificence, right? That is part of the cultural and maybe spiritual work that I'm invested in. Religiously, I think about the difference here between thinking about like the model of the factory, right? Where creation in the factory looks like mass producing one ideal type, right? And the kind of creation that I believe happens in this world, like when I look around and see human beings and dolphins and platypuses and jellyfish, right? I see manifestly a God who has not chosen for one ideal type, but has gone all in on riotous, brilliant diversity, right? And likes it, right? Wants it. For me, that's bedrock, that God too also cherishes the presence of mad, sick, deaf, disabled people on this earth, like wants us here. We belong.
Well, before I turn to Andrew, I have one more question. I loved the final chapter as a student of disability justice, and learning to unwind from the system of capitalism that we are all surviving under. There's a paragraph that I won't read entirely, but where you talk about how Shabbos can be a way for us to break from our life, but it can also be inaccessible. It can also be ableist in practice. And it makes me think about many friends, folks I know who are my generation, millennial or younger, who are rejecting religion, who are rejecting a religious Jewish identity or practice. And I don't know that there's data, but anecdotally, I know many disabled folks, my generation and younger, who have felt that Jewish customs and traditions have been exclusive or inaccessible. So how do we build a future where more young Jews, or really any younger person, wants to be called into Jewish practice and wants to discover their Jewishness more?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think the story that you tell about Shabbos or Shabbat, right, which the practice of Jewish Sabbath, I think Sabbath practice, Shabbat practice as this extraordinary invitation, some would say requirement, to rest on the seventh day, right? To actually, like, it's my day when I unplug. I don't, right? No tech, no computer, no phone, no obligation, no work, right? It's the day where my soul gets the sense of like, actually my value on this earth is not bound up with my ability to produce. That for me can be an extraordinary, revolutionary, as you say, anti-capitalist disability justice practice. But it can also be another kind of tyranny. Right? You can also use that to see, you can use, and Jewish communities have at times used Shabbat rules and regulations to say that people, for example, who are using alternative communication devices can't take them to synagogue on Shabbat, right? Thus cutting out people's ability to communicate or engage. So, of course, the question of how to navigate with that within the confines of a particular religious community is actually, I would say that's just very religiously, community specific. And I wouldn't want to, in this conversation, opine what any given community should or should not do. I think that those kind of norms have to be worked out and negotiated within the context of a community. But I give that as an example to say that the thing that can be liberatory can also be used. Ableism's got deep roots, right? And it can get us almost anywhere, right? So I too, in my Shabbat practice, I can put all sorts of expectations on myself about what rest has got to look like, right? And mess it up for myself. I'm not doing it good enough, right? I'm not even resting good enough. So it's an ongoing process. I think this work of decolonizing the mind, the body, the soul, that is to me deep spiritual work that is a kind of ongoing project. But when you think about, I think your question is also about like how to invite or open the door for more disabled folks who are Jewishly or religiously, spiritually curious to engage with Jewish or other religious traditions. I would say that for me, part of what I think it would be really helpful is to shift the question of where authority lies. So often I think we assume that to be religious or to do things with Jewish community, you have to like plug into an organized institutional form of what Judaism or, fill in the blank with your religious community looks like, right? Which means you then immediately have to interface often with a whole lot of structures that may not work in a variety of ways for your own body, mind, or politics or whatever, right? So one of the things that I think is really extraordinary as I'm kind of looking at the Jewish world today is to see the way in which we're seeing a real resurgence and an upswelling of Jews making Judaism for ourselves. Now, I mean, of course, I am a rabbi, so I'm in a weird position here of both being in some ways an outsider and deeply an insider. Right? But in this sense, I spend most of my time as a rabbi. I do a lot of teaching and work in organized institutional Jewish and sometimes Christian communities. But I also, a big part of my rabbi work is with political organizers and with queer and disabled spiritual folks who would never come near a official religious institution, but find themselves nonetheless having a kind of yearning for a space to grapple with spiritual questions, cultural traditions, right? Sometimes that's around questions of death or loss. Sometimes that's around grief. Sometimes that's the question of like, how do we go on doing deep political work when so much is stacked up against us? What sustains us, right? All of these questions, you don't have to, I don't think you need religion or spirituality to work with those questions, but there are, I think, powerful resources within the realm of religion and spirituality that can offer us sustenance. And it's my belief that we deserve access to that. And sometimes that means really pushing for and working for access in institutional spaces. And sometimes that means, right, making that magic happen in queer performance spaces, in disability community spaces, right, in places that are ours. And so that's also something that I'm really interested in, how to cultivate more of that sense that, yes, there's a lot of value to be found in, and also a lot of resources that are accessible, that should be accessible to us within institutional religious forms. And also sometimes the most life-giving spaces are the spaces we make for each other and the witness that we offer each other. It's disability community that taught me that, right? Queer community that taught me that. And that's something that I think I want to sort of offer back out.
I feel very, very full and delighted to be listening to this conversation and to be a part of it, which is on top of the fact I've had the treat of reading this book and discussing it with some of my students at Georgia State this week in a class on disability.
It's amazing.
And memoir, and it's been a fantastic conversation over a couple of days. I think the question that I find myself wanting to ask in this moment is I think I heard you, the two of you, Dom and Julia, like build towards this. And I was struck by, at the outset of our conversation, how you described this text as a love letter to disability community. And I wondered if you might reflect that, as I said, the title of the class is Disability and Memoir. And so, we've been thinking about how life writing or auto theory or various kinds of texts enable, spur, activate the project of disability justice. And so I wondered if you've given us an answer to some extent with your wonderful announcement of this as a love letter, but I wondered if you wanted to reflect a bit more about writing and the place of what the process of this was like for you, yeah, and what kind of world or community, or what kind of answer to Dom's question about practice and community, like what is made real through that, what can be made real through the act of.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I found myself, as I was writing, I spend a lot of time both when I'm wearing my scholarly hat, working particularly in both, I spend my time often working with and tangling with violence. I work with a lot of texts that are violent. I work with a lot of material. I mean, I work on questions of disability and climate change. I owe someone a link to that in the chat. So before I sign off, I'm going to find that link and share that in the chat. Thank you so much for asking. I spend a lot of time thinking about violence and harm. And part of my methodology when I work, part of how I write, is that I make a commitment to not shrink from harm and to not shrink from texts, particularly biblical Torah texts, Bible texts, right, religious texts, mm-hmm, that some of which I find really terrible, really difficult. And one of my commitments is to not make nice with them, right? Not to try to pretty them up and apologize for them, in part because I believe that I feel an obligation to truly see, to truly attend to the violence that has been done to so many marginalized and minoritized peoples. Often in religion's name, or religion has been a co-conspirator in the work of getting violence done. So that's very important to me. But alongside that, I also hold the conviction that joy matters. and particularly disabled people's joy, marginalized people's joy. I mean, this is something that I have been honored to learn so much from Black women, right? The revolutionary power of joy as both a political and strategic intervention, but also something that goes beyond politics and strategy, that's just like good in and of itself, that we flat out deserve. And so a lot of my work as a writer feels like it's holding both of these strands and trying to, right, not lose sight of one when I'm also acknowledging the other. And a lot of the envisioning work, the constructive work, the theological or ethical work is also devoted to dreaming up and envisioning and feeling like, what is that world we long for going to feel like against our skin? What's it going to taste like? How are we going to know it? Like, I want us to be able to touch it. I want it to get so real in our hearts that it helps spur us to like, yes, of course we can, we gotta do it. Of course we'll do it, right? Those two pieces, right? Holding them together and trying to keep them in right relationship. And same thing with disability, right? I mean, disability itself is a mixed bag. It's full of moments of pain and frustration and difficulty, and also full of moments of like beauty and unexpected pleasure and really amazing moments, right? And so same thing there too. I want to tell a story that embraces and acknowledges the wholeness of disability experience, not a story that just says, oh, you got to love every moment of your disabled life, right? But that says, like every other life with disability is a complex, multifaceted story. It deserves to be seen as a complex, multifaceted story. And we need better tools for holding that fullness and that complexity.
Thank you so much. There's so many, yeah, that's fantastic. Both description of, I think, what the book does, your articulation of the tension between violence and joy reminded me. Students were talking about and the ways, what was thrilling. In some ways, the ways in which your interpretations felt thrilling for the license that it gave them in relation to the text, but also the ways in which that did kind of crack something open for them in terms of, as you described, like what this other world feel like on the page. Like you might feel it for a second when the text turns in a way, and like, oh yeah, there's space there. And so, yeah, really lovely. We're also, I said I felt full and fortunate at the outset. We also have a kind of clutch of really wonderful questions here that are queuing up. And I thought I'd turn to some of these from the folks who are with us. I wanted to first turn to a broader question about, I think that the book answers in some really amazing ways, from Liz, about when encountering ableist religious texts, how you find yourself responding or choosing to respond to them. This question here: do you refute them? Do you reframe? Do you just say something new? These were the questions many of my students were asking as well. So I wonder what you might say about that.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I really, really appreciate it. I think I don't think there's a single sole strategy that I use. I do think that there are moments where a text can be, is sometimes read in an ableist way, but can be read in a more should be read in a more life-giving way. So I do think sometimes, so it's a mixed approach, a mixed strategy. But I think what I'd like to name, though, is something that I think is maybe bold in my approach, is that sometimes I'm willing to just say no to a text, right? I call this the holynope, right? Just sometimes you have to nope out on a text and be like, no, this is a text that is this is a text that is so steeped in violence that I don't feel like I can make nice with it. For me, a classic example of this is Leviticus 21, which is in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, there's a passage where priests with blemishes, the Hebrew word is mum, priests with blemishes are instructed, they're forbidden to serve at the altar, to offer sacrifice at the altar. And the different kinds of mumim, the different kinds of blemishes are like listed out in detail. It's just a terrible text, right? And unfortunately for Jews, it comes up every year, right? So we're like forced to confront it on an annual basis in synagogue in the Torah reading that week. I have heard over the years a lot of sermons, a lot of divrei Torah, where people are trying to make nice with the text, right? And on the one hand, I'll say, of course, 100%, I appreciate and value that impulse, because what it means to me is it means that the rabbi or whoever is speaking about the Torah portion that week, right, knows that there is something abhorrent about that idea of disability exclusion and is trying to find a way to say no to it. Okay? The problem for me is that it often feels really thin and apologetic and just kind of like well-intentioned, but it's not getting the job done, right? And so what I've come to do for myself with this text is to take this text as a witness to ableism. When I read it, I hear it as a reminder of how deep ableism is embedded in our culture, and also how frequently human beings have projected our prejudices onto God. So I flat out, and it's just a belief statement, I flat out don't believe that God finds disabled bodies objectionable, right? For reasons that I've already laid out in this call. I'm just like not interested in sort of finding proof for that. I just take that as a given. I do that as a point of principle because I feel that minoritized and marginalized communities are often forced to account for our lives in ways that are unfair and inappropriate. We get boxed into answering crappy questions, and we just shouldn't have to do it. Right? I don't want to, none of us should be obligated to give an account of our lives, to give a kind of, right, to justify our existence on this earth. Right? And so partly that decision to say, bedrock, I know that we are beloved deep down by whatever I and you call sacred. That's just non-negotiable for me, which means then when I'm thinking about the text, right, I'm thinking about, okay, so how did this get here? What do we do with it, right? How do we unravel this mess? So in the book, we don't have time to go into it now. In the book, I talk about the different ways that the traditional Jewish sources, right, also recognize that there's a mess here and grapple with them in ways that I find both interesting and sometimes unsatisfying or insufficient, right? And then use them also to kind of lay out this idea that actually the onus needs to be on the community to transform our perceptions, right, of the disabled person or priest as somehow insufficient or not measuring up or distracting or weird or whatever. Right? That's a community problem. Right? It's not a person problem with the individual body or mind. It's not a God problem. Right? That's a problem about communities. And that's something that I believe we have a religious obligation or political obligation, however you want to take it, right, to challenge and transform. So I think I would hold that up as one of the ways in which I'm thinking with some of the most complicated, difficult texts. And sometimes willing to say no to them. Right? There's other moments, though, where I find like what I would call moments of disability wisdom present within the biblical text. And so I want to like preserve both of these strategies as a possibility, right? To both name the fact that Torah, Bible, whatever, can be a text of liberation for disability communities, even as I think we also have to confront the way that it is has been used to do harm.
Yeah. I wonder, and in being mindful of time, if I'm going to attempt to, there's some wonderfully crafted questions here that I'm going to try to bring together for the sake of time. But following along these same lines, and I think it may be a question about strategy, going back to my earlier question, but I'm interested looking specifically at Alapa's question here in the chat, which is about this, what you spoke about before, about like good intentions and navigating good intentions, but also the dangers of what people might, activists will talk about as the charity model of disability and and then maybe also with Madeline's question about the healing stories and reinterpreting them along the lines we were just talking about. And so I might try to bring these together this way for perhaps a last question, which is thinking about these texts, biblical texts that are sacred to different communities, how you navigate between the holynope and solidarity, or like to cultivate for people who aren't maybe game, at the outset for the kinds of politics that you're recommending.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I find myself always doing when I work with communities around thinking about disability is to move us away from just thinking about disability in terms of feelings, like compassion for people with disabilities, right? Which I think can be an extraordinary and powerful motivator, right? But these feelings, I'm always interested in helping us think about how can we better catalyze these feelings so that they can help us recognize and reckon with some of the structural and systemic inequalities that disabled people face. I think sometimes actually, and this is a place where in my view, religious communities are especially liable to get kind of caught up, right? Because at their best, religious communities often nurture a kind of ethos of care and wanting to protect the vulnerable and do right by people. This is all great stuff, right? But it can actually be a little bit like abrasive and grating to like always be the vulnerable person. Like, oh, a vulnerability has entered into the space because I, as a visibly disabled person, has shown up there, right? So I am really interested in, I think this is actually partly why I'm interested in also helping us think about everyone, disabled and non-disabled, as having a stake in working to take down ableism, right? That actually building a world that is more welcoming for disabled people, that like a world that is better for disabled people is often a world that is more spacious for all of us. Now, in the details, right, so much is in the details, right? In the details, sometimes we have within disability community all the time access conflicts, places where somebody's need, right, somebody's access need butts up against somebody else's access need, right? So it's of course, we're speaking here broad brush, right? Working out the details of what this looks like in practice is tricky, difficult, important work. But I think that move away from charity and compassion, right, toward a sense of embodied solidarity, a recognition that in fact, while I don't want to obscure the lines of like the differences in terms of privilege and all of that, right, there is a way in which all of our bodies, if not now, will at some point be on the line here, right? That feels to me, right, like vulnerability, human, is something that actually affects all of us. So it affects disabled people. I mean, think about this so much during the pandemic, of course, right? It affects some of us more than others, and more acutely, more intensely than others. Right? And yet, if religious communities are only approaching disability work as doing for others, it presumes that disabled people aren't actually at the center of leading, involved in, invested in these communities and then this work. And that's a model that I think we have to change. It's part of why I believe religious communities need disabled leaders, whether that's as clergy or in other ways. Like, religious communities need disability voices. And in part, I think, to really shift up this dynamic of who's giving, right? That model of, certain people give care or charity to others, right? Disability communities often think at our best, right? I think we think about care very differently, right? As a kind of network, as something that's much more mutual, passed between us, right? You do what you can today, knowing that I'll be doing for you in my way shortly. That kind of embedded mutuality feels to me a very different model of thinking about care. And I think it's something that I would love to see religious communities dig into more deeply.
Mm-hmm. I have the privilege of saying, I mean, what a wonderful answer to that, your own call you've given us here with this text. And so I'd love to invite ER back to join us to wrap things up here. But I will just underscore my gratitude for helping make this happen. This book is really such a gift. And one that I think many of us will be talking about for a long time.
Thank you all so much. This was a beautiful evening. I want to let folks know that they can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Loving Our Own Bones, Disability Wisdom, and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole from Charis Books and More. Just one click and it'll get you there. We would love for you to purchase directly from us. It really does help us when you buy books from Charis. We also really would love for you to request that this book be carried by your local public library. The more ways we can make this book accessible financially to people, the better. We would love for you to also consider donating it to a high school library or a college library. This is a book that people, older high school age folks could potentially read, and certainly college. So we really appreciate all of the beautiful engagement and questions in the chat. And I know Julia will have a chance to read over the chat later. And I know that you did want to share out climate resources. So you can put
I've dropped climate resources in the chat, and also included my website, so if folks are interested in connecting with me. There's also plain language, a few plain language excerpts from the book available for a free download. So if that's something that you're interested in, or that you know somebody in your community who could benefit from plain language, you can find that on my website, and also catch my mailing list there if that's of interest.
Wonderful. So that's in the Q&A section, just if folks go look at that.
I'm sorry, did I put that in the Q&A rather than the chat? I'll add to the chat.
Yeah.
Great.
And this will be added to Charis's YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/Charis Circle in a couple of days. So if there are folks who should have been here tonight who would really enjoy this conversation, we will add that there with captions, and we would love for folks to watch it and share it. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you again to Nat, and thank you to the three of you for all of your great work. I hope that you stay safe and well, and come see us in the future.